Welcome to PACKOLUTION. In this podcast series, you'll hear the experts of the packaging industry talking about sustainability and the future of packaging. It is brought to you by Watron and hosted by one of its founders, Michaela Wachtel, and Sales Director Ton Kniepscher.
Hi, welcome to another episode of PACKOLUTION, the disruptive podcast brought to you by Watron. Today we have Caren McNamara and Bruce Stevens as our guest. Caren is the founder and Bruce the director of Concious Container. We will be talking about a reusable container system and glass packaging in the US. Welcome Caren, welcome Bruce.
Thank you, Ton.
Thank you, Ton.
Can you tell us something about your career path and how you got the idea of founding Concious Container? Maybe that's something that both of you might want to answer.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with both Bruce and I. And I'm Caren McNamara, and I founded Concious Container essentially because I got tired of throwing away glass bottles that looked like they could be reused. And essentially, I've seen the reusable systems around the world, and I looked at, we're here in California in the United States, and I said, well, what can I go do about it? Not talk about it, but what can I do about it? And so that's really where my journey began with Concious Container. I continue to travel this path. It's been challenging, but because everybody that I talk to about reusable systems here in California, they all say, yes, we want it. So that's why I have continued, founded it and continue to bring this reusable idea and business starting in the California marketplace. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Bruce talk about, he decided to join Concious Container, and there's a reason why.
Hi, I'm Bruce Stevens. I'm the president of Concious Container. And like Caren, I also got tired of throwing glass bottles away. And a little bit different in my scenario is that I live in the Sonoma, Napa area of California, which is the predominant wine region in the United States. And I couldn't find bottles. And I woke my wife up one night going, why isn't anybody washing bottles like they do in Europe, having spent some years living in Europe? And so I initially 12 years ago started a company called Wine Bottle Renew, which is basically exactly what we're doing right now with Concious Container. Our only issue is that we didn't buy the European washing equipment that is very, very highly regarded in the industry. We had some issues and we ended up having to close it down. But having had that experience, I found that there is just an enormous amount of interest in washing and refillable bottles, similar to what we used to do here in the United States back in the 70s and the 80s.
And what exactly does your company, Concious Container, do? And what is the goal of your company?
So what Concious Container does, well, I'll talk about the goal. So our goal is to build a reusable infrastructure model to bring reusable glass bottles back into our U.S. infrastructure and economy. That's the vision. We're also a benefit corporation, founded as a benefit corporation, which says that the leadership team in a benefit corporation has the flexibility to balance benefit and profit, whether that benefit is environmental or economic, social. And so our goal is to build the kind of the pipes of a reusable system here in the United States, but build it equitably and, with looking at the economics and the environmental benefits. And right now we are raising the capital to stand up this business. We ran many pilots. We also did an accelerator program with Anheuser-Busch where we piloted some bottles in a reusable system. And so what we're doing is we're turning on the business right now. We're finalizing our seed round of capital to raise money to get the bottle washer. And so we are right at the cusp of turning this business on. We also have the benefit of a $500,000 greenhouse gas grant from the state of California to use specifically for refillable wine bottles. So we're right at the cusp of turning this business on. And our goal is to turn it on, demonstrate how the system works simply, and then to scale it, probably first across California.
So basically, the bottom line is that there's various ways of being able to collect the bottles, whether they're from large producers that have overstock or bottles that were short filled and we can wash and sterilize those. But basically, we will collect the bottles, we'll wash, sterilize, and repackage and sell those bottles back to other wineries.
If I understood correctly, you started this as a B2B business, so business to business, but you need the consumer as well, don't you? How does this work?
Yes. And that, Ton, is a bit of the long pole in the tent. And we found that out in our Anheuser-Busch pilot program. And so what we're starting with is this straight B2B play where we're working directly with wineries to get those excess bottles and then sell them, wash them, as Bruce talked about, and sell them into the secondary marketplace for wineries, which are the smaller wineries. They're having challenges getting bottles. And what we're seeing in the marketplace in regards to how we engage consumers, first of all, California is a redemption state. So we have a deposit scheme here in California. So we can lean into that. We are actually part of that system. One of the pilots I ran is working with a redemption center to get those bottles. So we have that as a B2C play. But really the B2C play is going to happen with the beverage producer and the consumers. And so there's a lot of innovation going on, and we're working with some of those innovators that are, quite a few of them are here in California, where they are working on programs with apps to incent consumers, all kinds of program gamification and other programs. So we're going to lean into those folks, those businesses, and our existing deposit system to begin to cultivate the consumer engagement. There's a lot there, and consumers we know want to be engaged, but we have to help create with these innovative partners and existing systems to get those bottles back.
I understand. Thanks. That's a good point. Yeah.
We're a startup, not that we're creating anything really, these systems exist around the world, but what's really important with a startup is to really focus on a viable option. And that's exactly what we're doing. And then to begin to demonstrate. And some of what we're going to do is going to work really well and we'll continue with it. Some of it we're going to learn and we're going to say, hey, that's not going to work for us as we move forward. But what's really important is starting and being very focused on getting the business up and running. And it's really about demonstrating. And we have very large intentions and goals to scale at a very rapid rate, quite frankly.
Sounds very familiar to us. As you know, Watron is a startup as well. So it's going down memory lane, correct? Yeah.
And in our last episodes, we have mostly talked about plastic packaging, and we will also talk about paper packaging in the future. Now it's really interesting that we have someone who can tell us something about glass. I'm really happy that we have you here and tell us and our audience something on the advantages of glass as a packaging material.
First of all, customers prefer glass. I think that that's worldwide, that beverages taste better out of glass than they do out of a bag in the box or cans. Or plastic or PET type bottles. There's no question that glass has an unlimited recycling ability. You can turn that same glass over and over and over again. It's a good thing on the recycling side is because you can never have enough recycled glass for the glass manufacturers. They save an enormous amount of energy by using recycled glass as opposed to mining, the limestone and the soda ash and the sand to make new glass.
If you look at the glass package, there's glass, aluminum, and plastic. There's places for all of them, but when you look at, and there's studies that have been done, in particular in Europe, about a refillable glass bottle from an environmental perspective versus the two other packaging substrates. So a refillable glass bottle has an 85% lower carbon footprint than a single-use glass bottle. It has a 70% lower carbon footprint than a PET single-use bottle and a 57% lower carbon footprint than an aluminum can. We know environmentally right there that in a mature system, a refillable glass bottle has the highest environmental benefit. And then when we're seeing a lot of press about the challenges with the PET bottles and the aluminum cans, and all these three substrates are recyclable. When it comes to glass, glass really is the most recyclable. Though you can get like Bruce said, the most turns out of that bottle. And when we look at a glass bottle, the other challenge that sometimes comes along as a packaging, there's the conversation about a returnable bottle is typically a little bit heavier, and in some cases it has to be if it's a carbonated beverage. But the turns that we can get with that bottle, number one, are quite substantial, and it just really depends on, how heavy that bottle might be or how it's handled. But a glass bottle really trumps all the other packaging substrates when we talk about a reusable package. Even more so, it will have more turns than there is reusable PET bottles, and they are all over the world. But the glass will have more turns. It's just about the education and the demand that we already see for glass as a package.
One other thing to mention on regards to plastic and glass is that glass is inert. It doesn't leach anything into the beverage when you put it into a glass container. And there are more and more studies happening, and really you don't really need to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, but the health of the world has been compromised by plastic. Every aluminum can that you're drinking out of has a plastic liner. Plastic PET bottles obviously are plastic. Glass has nothing in between the liquid and the glass, and therefore it's much, much healthier.
It's a good point that you mentioned, but of course here we're talking about reusability and reusing bottles versus recycling of plastic, which of course requires more energy. So that's a different topic. But talking about the advantages of glass packages, which are of course numerous, especially if you reuse them, what about the disadvantages? In the case of glass, I think of risk of glass breakage and the difficulty of transport due to the weight.
Yes, glass, there is breakage, and transport due to waste is often what comes up in conversations. And really what we're trying to build here, Ton, is as we go to build out this reusable glass system here, is what's the optimum environment in regards to how heavy do we need to make that bottle? What are the distances that make the best environmental and economic sense? Mm-hmm. In that circular systems are not intended to really environmentally, they can't be, especially here in the United States, we're a big country, we're not going to stand up a bottle washer in the middle of the United States and be shipping things in and out. That was the way the old systems, that's the part of why they went away, was the consolidation of the industry. So really, at first, there's probably an investment in a little bit heavier bottle. How can we look into the future and say, okay, how far can we ship that glass? What is it going to look like from a transport perspective? Here in California, there's mandates for all of the trucking industry to move to electronic vehicles, EV. So as we move forward, how do we look at the weight of the glass, the number of turns, what's that optimal? And we've had conversations with Anheuser-Busch about this. So we've got to stand up the system and begin to work towards how do we optimize that in regards to the economics and the environmental impacts. And so, yes, glass has breakage. You've seen the systems in Europe where the crates that are used. So how do we handle that glass to optimize, reduction in breakage, get to the optimal weight? And as we move forward, those are, to me, the quote unquote innovation that we intend to bring into this particular marketplace.
They have to make it fit for purpose, basically.
Correct. Yes. Well stated.
Caren, you already gave us some numbers about glass and its advantages. And on your website, you say that reusable system has a 95% lower carbon footprint. Now, how did you calculate that?
So the beauty of what we're building is that these systems exist around the world. And there is a multitude of data out there that talks about the environmental benefits. We will be tracking all that data ourselves, but That 95% actually comes from a report from Owens, Illinois. It's a little bit dated. It talks about beer bottles, but that data has been proven, and that was a glass manufacturer who came up with that 95% lower carbon footprint, and that was based on the beer industry and around the world. The 85% I quoted earlier was a more current report that was a consolidation of 35 life cycle assessments by Reloop Platform and Zero Waste Europe. And that report was 2021 or 2020, I believe that came out with. So that's a more current number based on a consolidation. So what's brilliant is that data is already out there. And what we're going to be doing is striving to get to those numbers with our system.
And basically those numbers reflect the cost. I mean, these glass manufacturing plants run 365 days, 24/7 every day. They have a finite amount of bottles that they can produce through these systems. And the amount of energy it takes to heat the raw materials and some cullet, but mostly raw materials, is a staggering, it's like 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when you extrapolate all those numbers as to how many bottles come through as opposed to the energy it takes to wash a bottle, that's where those numbers come in.
That makes sense. Let's talk about the US explicitly for a moment here. How common is glass as packaging, and what is the mindset of people regarding packaging in general in the US?
Well, the brands and the companies are really striving to, always what is the consumer, how are we going to sell more? And convenience is absolutely huge for any consumer, I think, anywhere. And so what we have a bit of an advantage here is, in particular in California, is I think sustainability, we can all say that the bar has risen and is going to continue to rise, both in the consumer mindset and across business, right? There's business demands coming into place that are saying, hey, you need to track your GHGs, you have to track your greenhouse gas emissions, and you have to report on those. And so in the United States and in California in particular, there are incentives like the grant that we received and other avenues by which the mindset of the population is really more attuned to, hey, is this a sustainable package, right? I see people in our grocery stores reading labels, like, is this organic or where did it come from? And I think we're at a real pivotal point and a perfect storm to really bring reusables into our infrastructure here and begin to show how we can make these systems work. And packaging companies, they are developing, I think you've seen it too on the PET space, a lot of packaging is multi-layered on the PET side, right? And so companies like Colgate and others are developing products that are single, right? It's a single, you would probably know the word better than I, but a single. Monomaterials. Thank you. I knew there was a term for it. And so there is so much momentum in this space to make it either recyclable, or in our case, how do we make it at a higher level? How do we ensure that it can also be reusable and not broken down? So the momentum in particular out here is, and I think you've probably seen it around the world, just the awareness from consumers. I think that's a shifting tide.
Yeah, good point.
And I have another question that is maybe a little bit more technical. How does recycling work for glass? You already said a little bit about it, but I really mean from the technical point of view, how do you recycle glass, and can the material be completely reused?
I'll let Bruce take this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the beauty about glass, okay, on the waste stream glass, if it has labels in it, the temperature in the furnaces to use the crushed or cullet glass will totally burn off any labels that are on there. So the reality is that in the United States, in California right now, there's a law that requires all glass manufacturers to use 30% recycled content in their glass manufacturing, whether it's sheet glass or containers or anything. It's throughout the state is that law. And there's a lot of these glass manufacturers right now would like to be able to use more cullet or more recycled glass in their production, but they simply can't get it. There's just not enough of it around there right now. And that has to do a lot with the fact that in the United States, there's only 9 states that have redemption, which people bring their glass back. And a majority of the country here doesn't even recycle glass. And sometimes in a lot of areas, the waste haulers won't even pick it up. So it creates a big problem, and throughout there's federal legislation going through that's maybe going to create a national recycling or deposit bill, which would be fantastic for glass, because then it would incentivize people to bring that glass back. But for the most part, it's a material that can be completely reused. It has no issues. There's no quality issues. The only issue that you have with glass is that you need to color sort it, meaning that there's three different colors. There's flint, or the clear glass. There's green, which includes like an antique green and more of a vibrant green. And then there's brown, that is used for a lot of like beer bottles and things of that nature. And mixed glass, what happens in the recycling, in the waste stream right now, gets all mixed up, and it's very difficult from a return on investment standpoint to be able to separate that glass. So it's really key at the very beginning here to figure out how to separate the colors of glass so that we can utilize most of it.
And I'll just add another component to recycled glass. So glass is the most recyclable and the most efficiently recyclable substrate out there. I say that because in the aluminum category, the aluminum container is not all 100% aluminum. And so having to melt that down. And we also have a big challenge with recycling aluminum here, with a lot of the producers are now putting plastic sleeves on their aluminum, and it's creating a real challenge for the recycling of aluminum. But if you look in the data, the glass is the most recyclable packaging that's out there. And PET can be recycled also. They break it down into flakes, but the processing is quite much more intense. And one of the key pieces, Bruce talked about cullet into a glass manufacturing plant, putting cullet into, and it's like, if you've seen it, it's like molten lava. It's pretty amazing, actually. But when you put that recycled glass into the mix of the virgin materials to make glass, it reduces the temperature requirements. And so what a lot of the glass manufacturers, they want that recycled content, not only because Bruce talked about the requirements of recycled content for packaging, but also because it lowers the temperature to produce that glass, therefore lowering their carbon emissions to produce that glass. And so they're desperate. They want more and more of this recycled content. But recycling glass, there's a demand that exceeds the supply right now in the United States. And we believe that as we move forward, and hopefully we get a national bottle bill that passes, and there's a lot of growing momentum. But recycling glass is really straightforward. It can be recycled. It never breaks down. Whereas the other substrates, as time goes on, that recycled content will break down.
So it's like you have to downgrade them.
Yes.
You both mentioned a couple of times deposit schemes which were in place in California already. In most European countries, we have this deposit scheme to encourage consumers to return the packaging. It started decades ago with glass bottles and is now being rolled out to other packaging formats. Do you see this as a next step possibility for the US as well, or would it start in California first?
Absolutely. Oregon was, I believe, the first state that had a redemption program. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was Oregon. But what's happening is, to Bruce's point, all of these substrates, aluminum, glass, and plastic, they are desperate for recycled content. And so what's happening, and then there's the legislative demands that are coming in. Oh, you have to have a percentage of recycled content in your packaging. So what's happening right now is that organizations that really, quite frankly, control what legislation ends up being passed, They're shifting to saying we support bottle bills when they haven't in the past. The American Beverage Association, who has not been lobbying for deposits, they've shifted. They are now supporting deposit systems because the beverage producers and others need that recycled content. And if you think, and so how bottle bills are really redemption systems are at the core of how we get that recycled content.
And right now in California, like I said before, there are 9 states that have redemption or redemption systems in place. Only 2 of those actually have a deposit on wine bottles. And like we had mentioned before, there's some federal laws coming out that very well may change that nationwide. But right now, one of the issues that they found is that in California, anything under 24 ounces is, I think that's 560, 570 milliliters or whatever. Anything under that is only a 5-cent deposit. And they found that in a couple of these states that if you up the amount of the deposit, you get a better return on recycled products. So that's something that's coming out as well.
I think then the consumer starts voting with his feet and then they see the benefit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I have one more question about the recyclability. How much glass is actually recycled and how much ends up in landfills?
So the Glass Packaging Institute and a couple other AGR and a couple of other organizations, they figure that on recycling glass, it's about 30% in the United States. In recycled states that have recycling deposit schemes, it's upwards to 40%. The problem there is still 7 out of 10 glass bottles end up in the landfill. And right now in the United States, there's about 110 million bottles that go into the landfill every day. If you were to stand those bottles side by side, you could have a line that stretched all the way across the United States every day.
Wow. That's a lot.
Amazing. That's amazing.
And therefore, that's the opportunity from our perspective. The more we begin to capture those materials, and we all know we have to do a better job and we have to do it quickly, is with all that, how do we divert that glass? And recycling is still a big part of the solution, but how do we divert that glass and reuse it, whether that's through reusable systems or recycling systems? It's a huge opportunity.
I was just going to say, and the other thing that's really important to understand what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to turn glass, used glass that we can refillable, from a waste product to an asset. Because glass bottles are not cheap. They're expensive to make. They're expensive for the producers to buy. And there is a lot of possibility in that area for us as far as, making sure that we get the glass in and we can provide it to customers at a better price point.
I think actually in Europe we can learn from you here because in Europe we have this deposit scheme for beer bottles and for lemonade and stuff, but not really for wine, at least not to my knowledge. And I think in Europe, if we would be able to turn all these bottles back in again, I think there's a great advantage. So we can actually learn from you guys.
Yeah, well, like I said, there's only 2 states that have a deposit on wine bottles. But I think that federally, if this goes down, this will change the recycling of glass throughout the country.
Yeah. The glass industry has been established for many years. How does it look in terms of innovation? Is innovation, for example, lightweighting? Is that possible?
We've been working with the glass industry for the past 3 to 4 years. And the glass industry, they are innovating within their operations where there's RDOs during the furnace of the future. So they're bringing the technology, upgrading their manufacturing of glass to reduce their carbon emissions internally. So maybe scope 1, scope 2. And lightweighting, what's been really interesting is lightweighting has been, in particular, the wine industry, because they have a much heavier bottle, it has been a strategy. So statistically, the carbon footprint in a single package, glass bottle, wine bottle. And this actually, there's data out there. This is also on the beer side with the smaller containers, but 18 to 30% of the carbon footprint sits right in that glass container. And there's all different, types of emissions that are part that gets us to 100%. So what the wine industry has been doing is they've been looking at lightweighting, Ton, and the statistics that we're seeing out there they can reduce the carbon footprint by about 4% when they make that bottle as light as possible. But what their attraction is to what we're building is that there's nothing else they can do with that glass container. They can maybe reduce the emissions a bit with the glass manufacturers making their carbon emissions lower, but this is the last mile for them. Winemakers or farmers, especially here in California, they see what's happening, drought and fires. And so they see climate change right at their front doorstep. So they like the idea of a returnable bottle because that's the last mile for them and reducing the carbon emission for that particular package. They are looking at cans. They are looking at bag in the box, but those packaging platforms are really not the most sustainable. And when we come to the glass innovation, there is innovation on the glass side. We constantly work with the glass manufacturers. It's a bit of a challenging ask for them, but they are coming around.
Bruce, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the average wine bottle on a lightweighted bottle is just maybe a little bit over a pound or 450 grams. Uh-huh. And the issue that is challenging, obviously, yes, you can save a little bit on freight with a lighter weight bottle from a logistical standpoint. Usually when you fill up a container, and over here they're 53-foot containers with that'll hold about 24,000 bottles, and usually you'll hit a weight limit whether you have a lightweight glass or not. But the biggest issue with the glass manufacturers is that when you're putting a cork or a screw cap top on a bottle, there's pressure on that bottle coming from the top downward. And so you have to be very careful about how those bottles are made so that they can withstand having a cork inserted in them and not breaking on the production lines. And I think that's there's been a couple of cases that I know of where the bottles have gotten a little bit too light and a majority of them were breaking. And so they had to readjust. And there's a lot of technology that goes into making glass, certainly more higher than my pay grade, but certainly there is some innovation going on in that side of it as well.
I've seen an example here in Europe where premium brands and premium of whiskey, for example, used heavier glass to give the consumer the idea that he was buying a premium brand. And whiskey which was sort of mainstream was in a lighter weight bottle. It's quite funny. And I think the same that happens with certain wines. Well, I'm not sure, but I've seen examples in the market.
Maybe this is a good question for what you were about to say. We have reached the end of this episode. Is there anything that you would like to add, Bruce? Caren?
No, I think that the biggest issue that we have worldwide is that unless we figure out a way to recycle, and not just glass, but everything, we got a real uphill battle with our planet. It's a beautiful place that we're living in. It's a utopia that, they haven't found anywhere else in the universe. And I think that we really need to take care of our earth here. And I think recycling and having people's mindset change from a throwaway society is the major step in moving towards that.
I'll just make a final comment about what our observation is with these returnable systems that do exist around the world. And we're constantly talking to this, is beginning to shift business that these systems, there is investment required. And there's learnings that are going to happen, but we have to invest in systems that are profitable around the world. These returnable systems that don't exist, and they don't continue in South America and Europe and Southeast Asia. They're not running because they're sustainable. They have continued to operate because they're profitable. And so what's really lovely here is these are profitable systems. And now we have this, icing on the cake that says, hey, this is really sustainable. We already have the environmental data. So, this is going to take investment in expanding these systems. And now we have that added benefit that the sustainability is really off the charts, as we talked about earlier. So my comment is, this is going to take investment. We have to move quickly. To Bruce's point, we have a climate crisis going on, and packaging is a very big part of where we can make change and we can move rather quickly. So, and we do have conversations with the large producers, and we continue to dialogue with them about how we bring this system into the United States. But we have the perfect storm to move forward and make climate impact and also benefits to the business. The economics are what really drives this. And we also feel that the large producers that we're engaging with, it's continuing to have that dialogue about how do we, what investment is needed to really move the needle. And this is how we're going to move it in all categories of addressing climate change.
It makes a lot of sense, correct? Yeah. So this concludes another episode of our podcast, PACKOLUTION. Thank you, Caren. Thank you, Bruce, for sharing your experiences and your vision with us. Intriguing for us is that we can actually learn from America, in this case, and from the US. It's been really inspiring. Thank you very much. And hopefully our listeners have the same opinion. So please stay tuned in this channel for more inspiring episodes of PACKOLUTION with experts in the packaging industry. Thank you.